Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very inspiring show coming right up with two very special guests. Our first guest today is Kathryn Tristan, and she's here to share with us her book, Why Worry? Stop Coping and Start Living. Now, Kathryn is a research scientist and assistant professor of medicine on the faculty of Washington University School of Medicine. She studies our biological immune system and its diseases. She's also interested in the psychological immune system that represents our constellation of thoughts and feelings meant to protect us. So let's welcome to the show, Kathryn Tristan.
Thank you, Marianne. I appreciate your having me.
Oh my goodness. I mean, I'm so glad we're having this discussion. I can't think of a more important time than now than to be talking about worrying.
You know, it's absolutely true. It's sort of like worry on steroids right now. And I think anything that you and I and anybody else can do to help out, that's a worthy thing to do.
So why don't we share a little bit about your background? What started you to even become interested in the topic of worrying?
I take my experience from personal experience, I guess I would say. So, I'm a scientist, and when you overworry and you have severe anxiety, it's not really very scientific. So, what happened to me was early in my life in college, I was very stressed by the various scientific classes I was taking, and really had very few coping skills, I would say. And one day I started feeling very afraid, and my heart raced, and I thought like I could die. And I found out later that was a panic attack. But at the time, since I'm a little older, no one really knew what that was. And so I spent about the next 20 years trying never to have another one of those. And I probably needed to learn everything not to do, because at one point I decided to use my mind and body and spirit to overcome that. And from a very personal standpoint, decided to write about what I found to be helpful and add some science to it as well. And so my background is having overcome severe anxiety and not being able to travel very far, and to being now speaking about it, and was able to do international traveling. So my goal is just to try to help others as much as I can.
Oh gosh, can't we use your information and your knowledge right now, especially because you see so many people coming up. And I mean, it seems like every day we're hearing about people who are just overly stressed and worried. And so how do people identify when they get to this point where it's like, wow, I'm kind of past lines I should be past?
Well, the United States, actually, before the pandemic ever hit, there was an anxiety, a stress epidemic. And in fact, the United States is number one in the world in anxious people and having these emotional issues. So we were number one to begin with, and things are now quite a bit more challenging. And how do you know where you are on the spectrum? And I think of it as, when do I know if I'm hitting the red zone? And we're all stressed, but when is it too much? And I feel that it's too much when you start, waking up with your worries and over COVID or anything else, and you go to sleep the same way. You're on edge. Maybe you're overeating or undereating. And some of us are doing that to an extent, but maybe, you start having physical symptoms as well. So it's kind of the overreactions and the overs that you can tell now whether you've reached the red zone. And then we try to back from that, but it can be very severe, and even just normal anxiety can tip the scales into something more serious. So now's the time to intervene before it actually hits the red zone, if you haven't gotten to that point.
I think everyone knows what the red zone is. Most people, not most, but there seems to be a segment of the population that are just in that right now.
Well, there's also about 20% of people who were defined as a subset of people who are called highly sensitive person. and this is like an HSP. I think it's Elaine Aron who defined that, a wonderful psychologist. And these are people, and I include myself in that, who kind of tend to overreact. And also, though the good side is that maybe you're also very empathetic, you're very creative, very intelligent, and just are super sensitive, even to sound or things that happen. And when you get sensitive and you start having a lot of worry and anxiety, you are also sensitive to that. So knowing that how your personality is will help maybe guide you into trying to find ways to help yourself.
So what are some of the ways and the worst ways that we worry, and some of the strategies that we can use that would let us know, hey, we're doing more harm than good?
Well, I think that the number one worst way that we worry is something that I call terribilizing, or people call it catastrophizing. And what happens with that is that obviously things are very, very serious right now. But when we make every issue that we're dealing with as to blow it up, like as if blowing up a balloon, it can pop. And that's the idea of terribilizing, where you are making something that is an issue into the worst possible issue. And when we terribilize things, that has a physical effect on us. It has an emotional effect on us. And so, unfortunately, terribilizing is probably the worst way that we worry. And what I try to do is say, do the opposite to terribilizing, and instead try to possibilize and find positive possibilities to those negative thoughts that are percolating in our mind, and being proactive as well. So I think, right there, you've got the two sides of the coin: terribilizing and possibilizing. And where you are on the spectrum is where you want to try to move toward the possibilizing side, try to be more positive, but also proactive. It's not just a Pollyanna kind of idea. It's a very real way to deal with real world problems.
And that's something we call use right now, without a doubt. I mean, because I know in your book you talk about how a lot of this is awareness and choice. And I'd love for you to kind of expand on that.
Those are the two major powers that I think we all need to draw on more and more now. We, what I think of as how much can we control? Not a whole lot, except what we can control is our choices about things. Like the worry thoughts will come as if cascading on a conveyor belt, and you pay attention to one, you get a lot more of those because you're paying attention to that. But it's often unconscious as well. So the problem is we need to tune up the volume and actually hear those, become aware of those inner thoughts that are causing us such stress and worry and anxiety, and become aware, tune them up, but then realize you have a choice in the matter. You may not be able to choose those first worry and anxious thoughts, but your power lies in choosing the second or the third or the fourth. So you constantly have this battle, basically, of talking to yourself, trying to reassure yourself, trying to be realistic, but also soothing yourself and nurturing yourself. And I think that's probably the main thing that we need to be doing, is try to be making better choices, because we can choose those second or third or fourth thoughts, and we can choose the attitude that we have about something. And pretty much it boils down to that's the only choices that you necessarily always retain. No matter how bad things get, you retain the ability to become aware of how you're thinking and to choose and make better choices about how you are thinking. What are you saying to yourself? What are you saying to others? Those will always be our inner powers.
And that's so positive. And, and we kind of need that. We need a little, get our compass back on track, back to our due north, because it seems like a lot of times, especially with the time that we're going through, it's easy to let worry kind of just take over.
Absolutely. And the thing is, a lot of it is so unconscious. It's the way we were brought up. Maybe you were raised by worriers. Maybe that's just the things in your life have guided you down that path. So it's so automatic. And what we need to do is get off of autopilot. So it's easy to say that, but you have to actually start employing some positive tools to help yourself. And so some of the things that you can do is try to snare the negative thoughts immediately. I call it the stop, look, and listen method. When you're starting to go into the red zone, or you see yourself tumbling down this pathway, just see a stop sign, or shout the word inside stop. And these days, maybe you need to shout it out as well. So you just stop the train of thoughts that is running away and causing such misery. And maybe on a regular basis, learn to say stop, learn to stop that train. And then look. Stop, look, and listen. Look around the room. Acquaint yourself again back into the present moment. And if you are feeling severe anxiety, look at things. What color is the room? What objects do I see? Count things. Anything to stop the train and bring you back into the present moment. And then listen. Listen to more. And this is what we talked about before, about the choice idea. Listen to more comforting dialogues that are for yourself. Well, what would you say to your best friend if he or she were having a problem? And the other thing about listen is, maybe now, if you don't have it already, is the time to have a basically an affirmation toolkit, things that you can say to yourself during these little emotional crises, like, I'll handle it. This too shall pass. Things that you can prepare yourself for ahead of time will help you when you start going down the negative mindset and maybe pushing that into even anxiety.
That's so important. My goodness, and it's interesting because a lot of people have grown up, or maybe are in situations where they're feeling like they're being chased by a pack of wolves. And to know that you have the tools to stop and kind of refocus, that's such a big thing.
It absolutely is, and you're 100% right about that, because what we sometimes underappreciate is just how resilient we are. If you think of it, we come from a very long line of people who have coped and have lived to proceed. I mean, if you think about your grandparents or your great grandparents, maybe they came over on the boat and coming into who knows what life would be like. All kinds of things have happened to us over time, and even going back. I mean, our foremothers and forefathers have had to deal with lots of things, and we have much better sense right now of things that we can do to help ourselves. The science is better, the medicine is better. So I think we need sometimes to remind ourselves just how high we can bounce back when we need to. That's sort of like the American ingenuity, or even if you're from France, the French ingenuity. The whole point is that it's not how low we get, but how high we bounce back afterwards. And those are some of the challenges we're going to be facing soon, is that how do we bounce back from the economic crisis, from the health crisis, from our personal crisis? And those are things that we can do when we focus on our inner power. And kind of that's the secret mix, is that you do have inner power, you do have inner strength to draw on, and we will get through this.
Yeah, what a very important message to hear. And, so you wrote this book on dealing with worry and stress. What has been your own experience in dealing with COVID-19 changes?
Well, so I'm a scientist, and we were doing our research at Washington University, and suddenly, case after case was starting to appear, and then just almost overnight, the university completely shut down. All the students at the main campus, all the students and the staff, doctors, unless as you were needed, were suddenly that was just a sudden. You're home. You're no longer in your usual element. And many other people were in the same boat. So I think it took me really a couple of weeks. I felt like I'd been hit in the gut almost, like, what is this? How serious is this going to be? And when I caught myself kind of going to, I would say, the dark side, because this was overwhelming, then I started realizing, wait a minute. I am not going down the path that I used to go down. I can turn this around too. And so, at first, I think it takes time just to cope with your stress, to realize that, how do I adjust to this? So I can't say that I immediately just jumped right into worry guru. It took me some time also to kind of deal with myself and bounce back. So I think it takes everybody time, because this is unprecedented. But I have every faith that we'll all master what we need to master, overcome what we need to overcome, and we will find a new day. We'll have some challenges along the way, but I have every confidence we're going to do this.
Well, I'm sure we have listeners out there that have lost their job. Maybe they can't pay their rent or mortgage, and they're just worried and stressed out by everything. What would be some of the best advice you can give them in that situation?
So it's very easy just to say, hey, don't worry about it. But the thing is, worry is built in. It's part of our normal response, and we need to worry. Worry is biologically necessary. It helps you deal with some of the challenges that you currently have. So, for instance, if you've lost your job, you don't just say, don't worry, be happy. So at one point, then you have to figure out, what can I do and what can't I do? And I think those are two of the choices that we need to be focusing on. What can I do about the situation? And if I can't, then I know that I can't do this. So it would be helpful to talk, for instance, to a financial planner. It would be helpful to just really sit back and look at your finances, look at what your future may look like in different ways. And you can't necessarily know what's going to happen, but I think what you do is you look at the possibilities and look at them as positive possibilities. If this happens, I'll do this. If this happens, I'll do that. And the other thing is, if it doesn't go according to what you're thinking and your plan, then you'll handle that as well. Because I think we don't give ourselves credit enough for being able to figure out new solutions that don't appear to us now. I think we need to put out there how we want to feel, what we want to do, and then be open to how it comes back to us. There are no easy answers right now. And just by doing what we can, enlisting the help of people who can help us, then between that and our own resources, I think we'll be okay.
Yeah, sometimes it's just sitting down and making a plan, and it might not be the best plan that we want, or it still may provide a lot of stress, but at least start looking at it from a really logical position where we're like, okay, this is what's going on. How can we enlist help of other people? And I think a lot of times people are kind of afraid to ask for help.
I think you're absolutely right about that. And it's the kind of thing that we want to be perfect. That's partly what drives some of the worry and anxiety is we're perfectionists. We're used to being capable in our normal daily lives. Maybe we're the boss at the office, and now we're like, what is going on? What do I do? So I think being perfectionistic can be a very difficult road to go. And what I've learned is that just learn to accept occasional chaos. And in this case, maybe a little bit longer than occasional chaos. But the trying not to be so perfectionistic will help. And to ask for help. I think one of the lessons that I learned, that was a big lesson for me too, Marianne, you're 100% right. When I was trying to overcome my anxiety, I wasn't sure what to do. And what was so strange is I started seeing license plates as I was driving to and from work, and they would have number, and then ASK. And I thought, well, I kind of remembered that because it was a word. Then I would be driving home and I'd see different numbers in another ASK. And I swear that I saw that every day for weeks on end. And I thought, how many of those license plates can actually be in the St. Louis area where I live? And I was being a bit more metaphysical at that time as I am now. And I thought, what is the significance of this? Is it something that I need to think about? Is it some kind of a sign or some type of help for me? And I did realize after that it meant for me, ask for what you want out of life, expect that you can get it. And then when you need help, ask for that as well. And I think once I learned the lesson, I stopped seeing the ask plates, so asking for help when you need it, especially now, is an important thing to consider.
Is it your experience that younger people are going through like a greater amount of stress during this time?
It absolutely is. In fact, what was going on is there had been a study over the last 25 years looking at the emotional and mental well-being of students just entering college after their first year. And unfortunately, there had been a downward trend in the last 25 years. It never went up. It's always been going down. And so even before the epidemic hit, students were in a place where many more were anxious, many more were having emotional issues. And it almost seems to me we need to consider having some type of stress management earlier than when we get our kids into college. So kids dealing now are even, dealing with even more worry and anxiety. What's going to happen to my classes? Am I going to be able to get into grad school? Am I going to be able to stay in college? What about going away from home? So there are a lot of issues. And I think as any parents out there would be very, very well aware to think about talking or getting help for younger kids too, whether they're in grade school, whether they're in high school or in college. They've been dealing with a lot of stress and worry, and I think might need some special help now and are less experienced in stress management.
So in your book, you talk about, in your book, you talk about the core concepts. Can you explain that for us, please?
Absolutely. Since I suffered from anxiety, panic attacks for a number of years, that when I finally overcame that, those life-changing problems and came out the other side, I decided to write a book about it and put in lots of different tools to help people. And what I decided is I formulated, I guess, using my scientific brain, is how actually did I do this? And I realized that I didn't have this plan to begin with, but this is how it evolved, and this is what helped me really turn my life around. And I wrote it in the book as core concepts, because we're changing from the inside out. That's the strongest way to do it, not outside in, but inside out. This is where you make major changes. But the C in core stood for choice. And I think we talked about that before, Marianne, where we said, choice and awareness and choice are important. I may not choose my circumstances, but I can choose how I want to react to them. I can choose my attitude. So getting over any problem, the first thing is you realize you have choice. Choice is power. And then once you realize you can choose how you want to think about things, that's when I put in the O, which stands for outlook. There are a number of things that we have where we're perfectionistic, we blame, we're angry, we have guilt. There are a number of personality traits that really don't help us. And if we're trying to overcome a problem, what I put in the book was outlook makeovers, changing blame to gratitude. What can I be grateful about instead of what's wrong? Think about what's right. And anger, like maybe the message of anger is learning to cultivate clarity. Maybe I need to be able to represent myself, stand up for me, use I messages. When you did this, I felt that way. So, changing also required me to change my outlook. And the R stood for risks. And even though right now we're not thinking too much of risks, we're thinking of safety. Ultimately, when we are starting to get back with our lives, you realize that you're going to have to take a risk at some point. And even if you've made better choices, improved your outlook, if you're sitting in a car, the car's not going anywhere, even though you got a tune-up. So the R will stand for step by step, taking a little risk, building on the idea that you do have internal power. And then finally, E stands for embracing your inner spirit. That's the higher part of us, the happier part of us, where we can get direction. What will help us? Where you are on the spiritual spectrum is kind of helpful to you if you can figure out how to tap into your inner you and your higher self. So learning how to do all those things, those only 4 steps, but those 4 steps will make a major difference in how you cope with life and how you overcome your problems.
Oh boy, do we need that,
We do. We
do. Well, and and I love this because in your book you talk about how we can stop worrying like fast. And I'd love for you to expand on that for us.
So one of the things that I talked about earlier was to stop, look, and listen. And that's one way to stop worrying fast is to catch yourself while you're doing it by becoming aware, and again, living in the present moment. Anxiety, fear, it's always about the future, the unpredictable, and the future that we probably aren't guessing correctly anyway. They say 85% of what we worry about never happens. So learning to stop that train of thought. But another thing that I love to do is something that I call like a 5-minute reset. And I thought maybe I should call this a 5-minute soothe, because this is how you do it in a nutshell. Cross your hands over your heart. You take several deep breaths and just feel relaxed. And then think of something that you really like, something that you enjoy doing, and dwell in that moment for a few minutes, and then deep breathe again. Now let's really crank it up. Think of someone you love or something you love to do. And with your hands crossed over your heart and thinking about something you love and deep breathing, you will enter into a very peaceful state that changes not only your mental outlook, but it also changes your physical outlook and your emotions. And within about 5 minutes, when you're in that state, and you can come out of it by just deep breathing again, and then take your hands away from your heart and just feel how that feels to be relaxed. Do it in the morning when you wake up instead of worrying. Do it before you go to bed at night instead of worrying or thinking about the problem. So just even within 5 minutes, you can change your inner biochemistry and also feel that you have a tool to help yourself.
I love that. I just did that exercise as you were talking about. You can feel that you get really relaxed doing that. Oh my goodness. And it's just an easy, simple thing to do.
And thoughts have power. They have the power to make you miserable, that they have the power to pull you out of the depths of despair and to help you deal with the life as it's presented to you. And just learning to get into that mode where we have so many pleasant memories, so many things that we love, that will change. It changes your biochemistry, just as negativity and stress can up the cortisol and take a dip into your immune system. Well, why not help our immune system instead of contributing to damaging it? Let's do this. Let's learn to relax. Let's learn to stay in the positive mode, live in the present moment, and keep those immune systems strong and healthy.
So from everything that we've talked about, because we are going through a very unique time in history, and it's really unfortunate. People are losing loved ones, and we talked about, people losing jobs, unable to pay rents and mortgages, and there's just a whole upheaval going on. What would be some advice that you would give our listeners that they can take away with them today?
Well, first of all, learn to nurture you, because you may be at home and be the nurturer. So one of the things is to spend time to help you. It's not selfish, it's needed. The other thing is focus on, again, as we said, what you can do. Don't focus on what you can't. And the other thing is gratitude. There's so many things to be grateful for right now. I actually usually turn off the news and I'll listen, read things they're good. CNN has something that has the positive news. Radio has many positive stories. And so focus on things that you can be grateful for. That will, again, energize those positive strings in your body. And just know that you have more power, more inner strength than you realize. And if you can focus on the present moment, deal with the problems as you have to deal with them, but know that you can draw on that inner strength to help you through not just this challenge, because there'll be many more after this, but any challenge that you have in your life.
Oh my goodness, you're so right about that, because I think this time in history is really giving us the tools to be able to deal with every challenge that comes up from this point forward.
Right. It's amazing that what's, I'm actually, in science, and I can see that we're working on the research right now. People are working on the medicine. People are working on, how to retool your business in a different way. And we're creative and we're strong and we're capable, and we'll have strategies that we can't even imagine right now. But I've never seen people more dedicated, more, moving forward, putting up with what you have to put up with, but then moving forward, bouncing back. So I'm impressed. And I think as long as we can see the grateful things, the things that we can be grateful for, find it if you don't see it, you will be a happier person.
So, Kathryn, where can our listeners connect with you and learn more about your book and the work that you do?
So you can check out, I try to post things that are maybe inspirational or things, tools that you can use on my Facebook page, which is just Kathryn Tristan, and KathrynTristan. I also have a website that I also post some things and blog about what you can do to help yourself, and that's whyworrybook.com. That's one word, whyworrybook.com. So, and I also would encourage you to consider getting the book. It has lots more tools than we've had time to speak about, and I hope it would encourage you to work on yourself. And that's available anywhere, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. You can link to it from my website. So I think just, use those tools or use others, and whoever else can help you. There's also things like apps that will help you remain calm. And so use whatever you can to help yourself. You're worth it.
Well, you've got so much great information on your website. I mean, you've got right on the website page, it talks about like a COVID-19 update from you. And one of the things people can take, a bad news break, because we all are kind of getting overwhelmed with the news. And how important is that to go, okay, we need to take some time out from all of this. I mean, you've got some great information here for people to touch into and really start using in their lives.
Well, and there are practical things we can do. I mean, you get caught up in, being home or taking care of the kids or being by yourself or not with your loved ones, or your loved ones are driving you crazy. So there are things that you can do that are practical, that are easy. And I think some of those tools, even that we can use now, we can use for the future. The idea is be proactive. Do something that helps you.
Well, Kathryn, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Well, you're just delightful to speak with. I appreciate you having me on. I think we've had a great dialogue, and maybe we've given some people some things to think about.
Well, thank you, Kathryn. It's been such an honor to spend this time with you, and of course, to talk about your book, Why Worry? Stop Coping and Start Living. Again, if you'd like to connect with Kathryn, you can at her website, whyworrybook.com, for more information. Why Worry is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and select indie retailers, and of course, it's available in Kindle. You'll want to stay tuned for our next special guest. We have coming up Dr. Saul-Weiner, who's here to share with us his book, On Becoming a Healer, The Journey from Patient Care to Caring About Your Patients. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne. We're going to stop here for a quick break, and we'll be right back after these messages.
Internationally recognized and award-winning author Judy Goodman works and teaches outside the box of limited thinking. Working with people from every walk of life, her goal is to empower you to be the best you can be, no matter what the challenge is. Born with the gift of seeing beyond our normal vision, she has an extraordinary gift of working with every challenge. Teaching beyond conventional wisdom, her work is described as life-changing. Visit judygoodman.com. That's judygoodman.com.
There comes a moment when you realize you're somewhere special, when you discover that each beautiful creature that you see has been rescued from a life of absolute horror and brought to this incredibly free place. Here's where their lives were forever changed and where yours will as well. Discover over 500 tigers, bears, and lions at the brand new visitor center at the Wild Animal Sanctuary just outside Denver. For more information, visit wildanimalsanctuary.org. Discover true freedom at the Wild Animal Sanctuary.
Have you ever had the sense that your thoughts might actually be doing something?
Ancient secrets of manifesting have been masterfully revealed in the award-winning book Manifesting 123 by Ken Elliott. For the first time, the author's experiences and stories in this book describe exactly how your thoughts can create anything. You've been doing this all your life, but it's never been fully explained for you until now. Visit manifesting123.com for more information today. Manifesting123.com.
Welcome back to Moments with Marianne. We're here today with our next special guest, Dr. Saul Weiner, who's here to share with us his new book, On Becoming a Healer, the journey from patient care to caring about your patients. Now, Dr. Saul Weiner is a professor of medicine, pediatrics, and medical education at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He's also a deputy director of the Veterans Health Administration Center of Innovation for Complex Chronic Healthcare and the co-founder of the Institute for Practice and Provider Performance Improvement. He's the co-author of Listening for What Matters, Avoiding Contextual Errors in Healthcare. So let's welcome to the show, Dr. Saul Weiner.
Thank you.
You know, what an honor it is to have you here. And my goodness, I've got to ask you, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, I went to medical school quite a while ago. It would have been in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And I still remember it as being a really difficult experience. And actually, even the training that followed, some of that is normal and to be expected. Medical training is not supposed to be easy. But there were a lot of things that I went through that I didn't think were necessary and in some ways were counterproductive. And then over the course of my career, I had an opportunity to do a lot of research on physician-patient communication, which further solidified my sense that something wasn't quite right about the way in which we train physicians. I was very fortunate in that during my medical training, starting in my first year, I had a wonderful mentor. This was somebody I'd known since childhood who was a family physician, about 30 years older than me. And when I was really struggling during my first year of medical school, he and I started talking regularly and about the process of becoming a physician and about everything related to that, including what I was going through personally at the time. And I was so privileged to have that kind of a sounding board. I wrote On Becoming a Healer because I felt like, although it's not a substitute for having a personal mentor who is as excellent as the one I had, I think that a lot of the lessons that I learned from those conversations and from applying those conversations to my experience as a medical student and then later as a young trainee were ones I wanted to share with future doctors. And so I think that's why I wrote On Becoming a Healer.
So what inspired you even before that to become a doctor? Was there some life event that happened?
Well, that's a good question. You know, I think if you ask anybody who becomes a doctor the same question, they'll all have an interesting story. It is a bit of a calling for many of us. I think it was way back when I was actually in high school. I started out, I used to ski a lot, and skiing is very expensive. I don't know if you've skied, but skiing is very expensive if you live in a climate where there's snow, of course. And I joined the ski patrol, which is a patrol on every mountain that is there to rescue people when they break their leg or have serious injuries. And I had to go through a fairly rigorous training process to do that. And that got me interested in medicine. And then I trained a little bit more to become an emergency medical technician, also during those early years, and worked on a volunteer ambulance squad. And this was in a very rural area in Vermont, and really started to realize that this is something I wanted to do. It wasn't easy. I'm actually learning disabled, and I make that clear in my book. I'm pretty open about it. So embarking on the journey of becoming a physician was especially tough for me, but it kind of became something that I just knew I really wanted to do.
Well, I think having your voice in this discussion is so important because of the work that you're doing now, because you're really helping other minds to develop when it comes to medicine.
Yes, I've been fortunate in that my career has been at an academic institution at a medical school. And so I've had the privilege of spending many years training medical students and residents and learning as much from them as I've hopefully been able to contribute. But it's also kept me thinking about how we train physicians and many of the things that I think we could do better. And those were themes that I focused on on Becoming a Healer. I also emphasize in the book that many of the lessons are not just specific to becoming a doctor. I think they're life lessons. I think we draw too much of a line between the process of training as a physician and just the process of becoming a good person in general. I have a chapter, I think it's chapter 5, where I talk about what I think are the qualities of any healing interaction. Don't need to be a physician. I think there are many people who are not physicians who are healers, and many people who are physicians who, quite frankly, are not healers. And I think that many of us are healers on some days and not so much on other days, depending on how we're doing. But I think that there are qualities of any interaction between two people that are fundamentally healing. And I think we all have that sense when we walk away from an interaction every now and then with another person. It could be a close friend, but it could also be someone in the checkout line at a supermarket. We have these interactions every now and then, hopefully more often than not, where we just walk away feeling good. We feel like, wow, that was I wasn't feeling very good, but that interaction with that person left me feeling a lot better. And I think those are the kinds of interactions that I refer to as healing interactions. And I think they're critically important in the doctor-patient relationship, all too rare. And I spent a lot of time trying to characterize them, to talk about what are the elements of those interactions that leave us all feeling better.
Well, I'm so glad that you dived into that, because that does make a big difference. And it's something, no matter where people are in their journey, they can use this information, kind of like developing life skills to move forward.
Yes, and I think that in thinking about what makes for a healing interaction, and again, this is not specific to being a doctor, it's really any two people. I think there are two elements. One of them is what I call interpersonal engagement, and the other is what I call boundary clarity. And this was something I talked with my mentor a lot. Interpersonal engagement is simply what happens when two people are giving each other their full attention. There's no one is on a higher plane. No one's looking. It's not like one person's looking down on the other or looking up at the other. There's a sort of sense of shared humanity. It's unself-conscious. It's completely open. Those are all aspects of what I call a fully engaged interaction. It can happen between two strangers. It can happen between two people who've known each other for years. And I think it's all too uncommon in our society. People tend to be guarded. They tend to hold each other at arm's length. But the other element of what I call a healing interaction is that there has to be boundary clarity at the same time. Boundary clarity is just a fancy word for really respecting the boundaries that separate you from the other person. So not being intrusive in ways that are ultimately going to undermine that person's sense of well-being. And I think it's a little bit of a tougher concept, but I think we all know when somebody's sort of violating our boundaries, we feel uncomfortable, we feel somewhat intruded upon. And so I think it's the ability to have those two things happening at the same time, be fully open and at the same time to respect boundaries. And obviously, I feel like this is a vital topic for training physicians who hopefully are engaged in healing interactions in every encounter. But one of the things I talk about in the book is that I think physicians are often acclimated not to engage. They hold patients at arm's length. They're somewhat remote. They may come across as very professional, but sort of scripted, what I often describe as a kind of doctor persona. And I think patients have come to be used to that, but I ultimately don't think it's really nourishing either for the patient or for the physician. And, it's an important issue for physicians too, because there's such a problem of physician burnout these days. And I think that part of the reason physicians burn out is that if they're holding patients at a bit of an arm's length, day in and day out, visit after visit, then it's not really a very fulfilling or nourishing interaction. And so I think this is an important issue, not just for quality of care, but also for the well-being of physicians as well.
So how do you feel that physicians can, dance that line in many ways where they can be engaging but still hold those boundaries?
I think that it has to go beyond just thinking about the doctor-patient relationship. I think that as people develop as physicians, they also have to develop as people as well. And they have to think about the way in which they relate in general to other people in their lives. I don't think you can compartmentalize these sorts of things. I think physicians are kind of beat on while they're going through their training. I think it erodes their sense of self-esteem. And because of that, I think they develop some pretty deep insecurities, or those insecurities are often I think, heightened over the course of their training. And I know that sounds odd to people outside. You think that physicians would have a very high sense of self because, after all, they've made it through all this tough training. You think they'd have a very strong sense of, being solid and so forth. But I actually think it's the other way around. I think the training often leads physicians feeling a little insecure and maybe unsure of themselves. And so they develop which makes them, by the way, uncomfortable around patients who have strong emotion. When patients are crying, when they're angry, those are times when it's important to lean forward, not to pull back. And I think that physicians often find themselves a little uncomfortable in that environment, and they tend to develop a kind of persona where they're holding the patients at arm's length. And it's because of a discomfort. And I think that may in turn come from perhaps a poorly developed sense of personal boundaries. These are tough concepts, but I think they're critical. And I think that physicians who can learn to become comfortable in the presence of grief, in the presence of anger, both in their personal and their professional lives, are not going to have to hold other people, whether it's patients or loved ones, at a distance. And I think one of the things that's unusual about Unbecoming a Healer, the book, is that it doesn't differentiate between who you are with your patients and who you are in the personal sphere in your life. And I think most books that talk about training professionals generally don't go there. They tend to focus very much on, how do you handle patient interactions? But I kind of go beyond that. I feel like patient interactions are fundamentally human interactions, and physicians ultimately have to confront who they are in all aspects of their life if they ultimately want to be healers.
Well, that's probably very relieving for some physicians because they can be their authentic self and really care about the patient without having to put up these walls and boundaries, and thinking, gosh, I have to keep them at arm's length all the time.
Yeah, I think so. Although I think that for many people in medicine, and quite honestly in society in general, they may not know how to do that. They may not know how to engage because it's not something that is common in our society. I think we find people every now and then who are very engaged, who are very warm, who are truly themselves, but not that many. And I think that people who end up in medicine go through so much in terms of hours and hours spent cracking the books and studying and taking multiple choice tests and being, their feet being held to the fire, that I think even if they came into medicine with that sense of warmth and engagement and connection, that it may erode over time. And so I think in many ways, medical training sort of pushes them in the wrong direction. I also think that the capacity to have clear boundaries is closely related to the kind of relationships that you have early in life, often, for instance, with your parents. In one part of my book, I think it's in one of the early chapters, I give an example of, talking to your mom or dad about what you want to do with your life. And imagine if, your mom or your dad is a professional who is very successful in their law firm or their engineering firm, and you want to go off and be an artist or a theater major, and you'd like their opinion about it, but they're a little uneasy about that. They'd rather see you play it safe and end up in dad's law firm. That's a lack of boundary clarity. Obviously, if you talk to mom or dad about that, they're going to give you a somewhat biased opinion that's not going to just reflect back to you your hopes and dreams, but is going to reflect perhaps their agenda. Even though it's a loving agenda, it's going to reflect their agenda. And I describe that as an example of poor boundary clarity. I say that when you are looking for someone to talk with about what you'd like to do regarding almost any important decision, you are trying to find somebody who doesn't have any agenda other than helping you figure out what's right for you. And that's, I think, a very good example of what I mean by boundary clarity. In the same way, I think that if you're a patient and you're talking with your doctor about an important decision, like whether to have surgery or whether to take a medication that could have long-term side effects, you want someone who doesn't have any agenda other than helping you figure out what is going to be right for you. So that's what I mean by boundary clarity. And I think that we learn these things often by experiences early in life. And that's why I think it's so important for us to consider how we've been shaped early in our lives and our relationships with our parents ultimately, if we want to become somebody with a clear sense of boundaries who can engage in healing relationships as adults.
How can our doctors find somebody who would be a mentor in their life that is in the medical field that can kind of give them that kind of guidance they're looking for in that type of career?
It is tough. I was just fortunate to happen to know someone like that, and I think that they're rare anywhere. Of course, I think one can have many mentors and get different things from different people. I often encourage young physicians, medical students, to look not just for one magic person who's going to be their mentor, but to look for strengths in different people who they can learn different things from. I think that you may find people who are going to be wonderful sounding boards at different stages of your life for different types of challenges. It may not all be one individual. And so that's one of the things that I encourage people to do. Certainly On Becoming a Healer is intended to be a bit of a companion to people going through medical training. And actually, I think others might find it very useful as well, because the themes in the book are not really specific per se to just becoming a doctor. They're really specific to kind of growing as a person who is fundamentally accessible to other individuals, who can provide can be a healing sounding board for others, who has a clear sense of boundaries. And again, I don't think it's a substitute for having a wonderful mentor, but it's intended to be somewhat of a guide. Each of the chapters ends with a series of challenge questions. For instance, there's a whole chapter on judgmentalism. One of the things I talk about is we all have a tendency to be judgmental of others in one way or another. And we tend to be judgmental of ourselves as well. And so there's a chapter that sort of challenges the reader to think about the ways in which they're judgmental. How do they tend to judge others? And by the way, we've been seeing a lot of that in the news lately. I mean, we can judge people because of this color of their skin. We can judge them because of their gender. We can judge them because of something they said that we think is a statement about who they are. And so I think that thinking about how we judge people is just one example of a theme that my mentor helped me think about a lot in my own development, and is something that's critical for anyone who is headed into the healing professions.
Yeah, isn't that the truth? I mean, we're in such a pivotal time where judgment is really kind of front and center, and everyone's really having to reassess if they have judgments and evaluate those.
Yeah, and I think that the bottom line is, yes, we are all judgmental, and I think that that's something we have to accept. But what's really important is not to somehow try to be this incredible person who's never judgmental, because I don't know if any of us ever get there, but to become aware of how and when we're judgmental so that we know that it's a problem that we have, that we all have. And so if we have that sense of self-awareness, then we can, to some degree, mitigate it. We can, to some degree, help prevent it from impairing the way we interact with others, particularly when we have great responsibility for their well-being.
So you talk about in your book how healers are realists. Why is that?
That chapter in many ways tries to confront what I think is a bit of a myth, which is that healers are just idealists. Everyone talks about the fact that, when you're young, it's so important to be idealistic. It's considered just one of those things that young people should be. But one of the problems with idealism, at least as I see it, is to some degree it's built on a myth. It's built on this myth that somehow if we're optimistic enough, we can change the world. And while, of course, I think it's important to go into life with the goal of changing things for the better, this somewhat inflated view that we can change the world often leads to disillusionment. And what I've often found is that people who describe themselves as highly idealistic often seems to be the ones who burn out first. And what I mean by that, and I give examples of people who come into medicine saying, I'm going to go off to a developing country and I'm going to become a physician like Albert Schweitzer, who went off to Africa, and I'm going to just become that incredible doctor who cures the next disease and heals people in a poor community and so forth. And I kind of joke about the fact that these are the first doctors who I know are going to end up in a super subspecialty practice in a small elite community where they have 2.3 kids and an SUV and end up doing none of the things that they aspire to do. And it often ends up that way because they dip their toes in the water. Maybe they go off and work in a developing country while they're in medical school, and they discover that things are not at all as easy as they thought they would be. They discover that, once they get there, all the things that they were hoping would happen just don't happen. They don't get the respect they think they want. The supplies aren't there. And what I talk about is how people who ultimately really do change the world are the ones who are fundamentally realistic. They go into situations knowing that it's not going to be easy, that there's going to be an enormous amount of pushback, there's going to be an enormous amount of frustration, that gains are going to be slow and incremental, that they're going to require an enormous amount of effort, teamwork, and that part of the joy of doing it is just the experience itself, of seeing what life is really like, of forming relationships with people who are like-minded, of finding joy in one interaction at a time. Those are the people I describe as realists, and those are the ones ultimately who I think do change the world.
Yeah, it takes a village with that one, right? I mean, my goodness, there's so much work that needs to be done and a lot of ingenuity, I'm sure, that has to happen there as well.
Yeah, and I think if you look at activists, people who ultimately do make a big difference in this world, they have enormous patience and perseverance, and they tend to just keep at it and keep at it. They may not get the glory. They depend on many people who often disappoint them, but they just keep at it. And I would describe those people as realists. And they're the ones who ultimately bring about the big changes that end up helping so many of us.
So you mentioned burnout a little bit ago. How do you think your book can help people that are going, maybe experiencing burnout or headed there?
I talk about the fact that burnout is due to both external and internal factors. I think that physicians often highlight the external and may be less aware of the internal. By external, I mean the general frustrations in life of doing any job in the modern era. If you're a physician, you're dealing with the incredible frustrations of the electronic medical record, for instance. And once this interview is over, I'm going to go and take care of patients, and I'm going to probably cursing at my electronic medical record as the computer screen freezes and the orders I try to place don't go through, and the insurance company doesn't answer my phone calls, and that alone can really wear you down. And I think that's an external cause of burnout. But I think the internal cause of burnout is at least as important. And that's what happens when you're not really engaging with patients, when you see patient after patient in 15-minute increments, and you're simply basically a task completer. Your doctors are often trained to be very efficient at completing tasks. So the patient comes in and you say, "Hello, Mrs. Jones, have you had your mammogram? I think I need to order some blood work. I think you're due for a colonoscopy. Have you had your flu shot, et cetera, et cetera." And then next patient. And there's no real human connection there. And while I do know that you have to get a lot of tasks done when you're with patients, I think it's not forming those human connections that ultimately leads to burnout. And that's where I think physicians need to look inwards in order to find ways to ultimately make medicine nourishing.
So we've been talking about just what's happening right now. We're also going through this pandemic. How do you think this is putting a strain on, the doctors that we're working with and the nurses? Are they prepared for this type of a crisis?
Yes and no. And I've been caring for patients in recent months, so I've had frontline experience with that. I have a couple observations. One is medical training does indeed prepare you really well for putting one foot in front of the other. When you're going through those years of training, it requires a lot of stamina, and you simply just have to keep on going. And so I think people who make it through medical training are highly resilient, and this serves them very well in a crisis like the one we're having now, when you just have to keep showing up, keep at it despite the despair and the misery and the heartbreak and the fear. I trained actually during the HIV epidemic before medications were available that cured that disease, and our patients were desperately ill and they were dying, and we were always terrified that we were going to stick ourselves with a needle and end up with the same condition. And so I think that medical training does in fact prepare and select for people who can just run a marathon. Where I think it falters is in some of the aspects I was talking about earlier, which is the capacity to find joy in those relationships, the relationships with patients. And one of the problems with the current environment we're in is that it's much harder to do that now. And I speak personally. When you're wearing a face mask and eye goggles and gloves, and you're fearful that every moment you spend with a patient is putting yourself at personal risk, it becomes much, much harder to have meaningful, engaged human interactions under those circumstances.
It's just got to be extremely difficult. I couldn't even imagine, having to be geared up all the time. It's difficult enough with that, and then having to also have the added stress of, hey, am I going to take this home?
Yeah, and wearing that mask, particularly the N95, is not comfortable, and it's just distracting, and talking is difficult. So much of what's important in the doctor-patient relationship is directly compromised when you have that kind of physical barrier.
How do you think the medical profession's going to hold up throughout all this? You think, they'll get through this okay?
I don't know. I think that my sense is that physicians, and again, I would say the same thing for nurses as well, are good at putting one foot in front of the other. Just, they have a lot of forbearance. They'll just keep going. I think that's one of the really admirable qualities about people who train as physicians, is just that capacity to keep on going. I think now that there's more protective gear around, I think that's been a really important step. It was awful when physicians couldn't safely protect themselves, and that applied also to all the frontline workers. I think it's better now. I think that physicians have done a really good job of reorganizing healthcare in the current environment. There were some major changes that had to be made very rapidly when the pandemic hit, in terms of moving as many patients as possible over to telehealth, both to protect providers, physicians, as well as to protect patients so they could get care from their home, to triage patients rapidly, to reorganize staffing and beds and ICUs in hospitals so that we could make room for COVID patients. There was a frantic 3 months there where we were all just trying to reorganize healthcare. And I was really impressed with my colleagues and their ability to re-engineer everything under such difficult and rapid circumstances. So I would have to say I'm actually quite optimistic about physicians' capacity to function under these conditions of crisis. What I worry more about is the burnout that comes from a lack of kind of human nourishment under the conditions that you face when you're wearing all that protective gear and you're constantly fearful for yourself, for your patients, and for your family. I think physicians do find a fair amount of camaraderie in their relationships with each other. I oversee a lot of residents, and I find that they do a wonderful job of building a kind of community, which I think helps them as well. And I'm not as familiar with what the other healthcare professionals are doing to kind of maintain the morale, but I'm hoping that some of the same rapport is helping them there as well.
If there was something you wanted to leave our listeners with and how they can support doctors or just show up better, what would you ask for them to do?
Well, for one thing, don't get sick yourself. That's good for you, and it's good for the healthcare system. Take good care of yourself. I think physicians definitely appreciate, and other healthcare professionals appreciate being appreciated. And there's been quite a bit of that. I think that people who are who know healthcare professionals can certainly support them by letting them, reaching out to them, seeing how they're doing. They're just like you. They're just like everybody else. They need support, and being appreciated helps. I think there are organizations which are helping other types of healthcare professionals. And I think it's important not to forget them either. I think that a lot of the people who are putting their lives at risk may not even be nurses or physicians. They're the folks who are keeping the hospital running, who are keeping the rooms clean and the beds changed. And I think it's really important not to forget them as well.
Well, Saul, where can our listeners connect with you and learn more, not just about your book On Becoming a Healer, but also be part of your community?
Well, we have when I say we, I have a colleague who I've spent many years studying physician-patient communication with, and we have a website, www.contextualizingcare.org. And you may be wondering what the word contextualizing care means. We wrote an earlier book a couple of years ago about the challenge of incorporating patient life context into care. And one of the things we were interested in was how physicians either are successful or unsuccessful at taking into account the life challenges that patients face when they plan their care. And I'm talking about financial challenges that get in the way of paying for medication, competing responsibilities. Patients often are caring for sick family. They work the night shift. They often lose social support. And one of the things we've been interested in is how can we help physicians become more aware of the life challenges that their patients face. So we created a website where we kind of share our findings, our research studies, the books we've written. We've got a lot of videos and so forth. That site may be of interest both to patients as well as to healthcare professionals. And again, it's contextualizingcare.org.
Well, Saul, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your interest.
Well, thank you, Saul. It has been such an honor to spend this time with you and, of course, to talk about your new book, On Becoming a Healer, the journey from patient care to caring about your patients. On Becoming a Healer is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and select indie retailers, and, of course, you can get it on Kindle. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Sunday, Monday, Thursday, and Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern and 5 p.m. Pacific Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.